My name is Corey Amron, and I'm chair of the Standing Committee on the Gavel Awards. We are so pleased to welcome you to the presentation of the 2013 Silver Gavel Awards for Media and the Arts. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors. First of all, the SMU Dedman School of Law. We are so pleased to have them be our sponsor again this year. And thank you. And I'd like to thank my law firm, the Vorey, Sater, Seymour and Pease, who is sponsoring this as well. It's really their generous support that allows us to have this wonderful reception. So we'll have another round of applause for the food and the wine. So to begin our program, I am really delighted to introduce the president of the American Bar Association and a longstanding friend of mine, Laurel Bellows. Laurel is a business lawyer and principal of the Bellows Law Group, PC, in Chicago. She's an active bar and community leader. She has served as chair of the ABA's Policymaking House of Delegates and as chair of the association's Commission on Women in the Profession, among many, many achievements. So I'm pleased to introduce ABA President Laurel Bellows.
Hello, everybody. This is my only chance to ever feel like I'm 5'7", and it's a whole different perspective on life. So you journalists and media folk out there need to know that you make assumptions about, the way people view things, and I can give you a whole different perspective on viewing many, many issues and people and belts. In any case. Thank you, Corey. I want to say I have some written remarks, and I'm going to use them today because there's so many people who are doing so many special things. But I want to start out by talking 1 second about my friend Corey Amron, who is the perfect chair of the Gavel Awards. And I never get a chance to do this because she's always running to a different place and we're going in different directions. But I'd like to say that I was looking for words to describe Corey as it relates to what we're doing today. And I would say she is the perfect mix, in addition to being a great lawyer, a lawyer's lawyer, and highly intelligent. But she's the perfect mix of curiosity and courage. And that's the way I'd like to describe my friend Corey today, because that's what this Gavel Award takes. It is rewarding the curious and the courageous for taking on issues and writing about issues that aren't necessarily popular issues. And Corey was always there alongside me or in front of me on some of the issues relating to gender equity, which I don't have time to talk to you about, but I'd love to. But when Corey was chair of the Commission on Women and I was her follower, it was a sight to watch because there was no issue that Corey was not willing to address with vigor, using both her brain power and her creativity. So Corey, I just want to congratulate you on your leadership of this group. The Silver Gavel Awards recognize outstanding efforts in the media and the arts to foster the American public's understanding of the law and our justice system. Presented since 1958, these awards are one of our association's most cherished and important annual traditions. They play a crucial role in serving to deepen our understanding of the law, its role in society, and the challenges we face in securing justice for all. The Silver Gavel Awards have a rich and distinguished history. Let me share a few of our impressive award winners from prior years with you. From 50 years ago, To Kill a Mockingbird, the classic film version of Harper Lee's novel, starring Gregory Peck as Atticus Finch. And in 1963, Fred Friendly's Storm Over the Supreme Court, TV program produced by CBS Reports. In 1974, National Public Radio's coverage of the Watergate constitutional crisis on All Things Considered. Revolving Prison Doors, a 1985 Detroit Free Press series on inequities in the Michigan prison system that led to early release of criminals. Jonathan Harr's 1994 book, A Civil Action, a now classic work of novelistic nonfiction about a complex liability lawsuit and its aftermath. Oyez, 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 a multimedia site on the US Supreme Court developed by political scientist Jerry Goldman, which in 1998 became the first website to earn a silver gavel. From 2009, The Response, a 30-minute courtroom film dramatization based on transcripts of Guantanamo military tribunals. And finally, last year's documentary category winner, Women, War, and Peace, I Came to Testify, a documentary about Bosnian women, courageous survivors of mass rapes, who took the witness stand in an international court of law. These are just a few of the many outstanding award winners throughout the past 56 years. And on a personal note, I'd like to add that today, I think these awards come to us reflecting a current status of the world. If you would just think for a moment about Syria and Egypt, if you think about Iraq, if you think about nuclear threats from Iran and Korea, if you think about Zimmerman in our country, the Violence Against Women Act that we had to fight 1.5 years to reauthorize, if you talk to me about human trafficking, what I refer to as modern-day slavery here in this city, in our country, everywhere, cyber theft, threats to our national security, PRISM, privacy. There is nowhere you can turn in this world of crisis today where it is not imperative that our media and our arts, our journalists, help us understand what justice means and our rule of law, because our country is not immune from threats to our rule of law. And it's the media and journalism and the arts that I believe will assure that our public understands the wonderful world in which we are lucky to live in this United States of America, and how we can go about assuring that our way of life and our democracy continues. For 2013, we are awarding 4 silver gavels in the following categories: books, documentaries, newspapers, and television, as well as 4 honorable mention citations. Corey Amron, who you've met, the chair of the Gavel Awards Committee, will introduce each of the award winners and highlight the outstanding contributions they have made in advancing the American public's understanding of law and the justice system. Corey, you're up. Here, let me help you kick my platform.
Thank you, Laurel. The first thing I wanted to point out to you is, everybody raise the program up. Do you make sure everybody has one? Great, good. Okay, you don't have to be reading them now, but after we're through, please do read. There is a wealth of information in here about the honorees and the presentations and the awards. And most important, if you want to read or see these the videos, read the articles and all the programs that we are honoring today, there is detailed information on how you can get each one of these things, and I really urge you to do that, because they are, each of them in their own way, amazing. So we will begin with honorable mention citations. The 2013 Gavel Award honorable mention for books goes to Stand Up That Mountain, the battle to save one small community in the wilderness along the Appalachian Trail. Simon & Schuster, Scribner, publisher. Stand Up That Mountain tells the story of the 5-year legal battle to stop a gravel mine owner from dynamiting a mountain. Bellevue Mountain is in rural Avery County, North Carolina, next to the beloved Appalachian Trail. Trained as a lawyer, author Jay Lutz is a protagonist in his own story. He learns of the plan to tear down the mountain from neighbors, rural mountain people, and decides to get involved. Southern Environmental Law Center lawyers take on the case pro bono. Lutz guides readers skillfully through the twists and turns of the judicial process. He brings his characters with names like Curly and Wingfoot and Heelhound vividly to life. Even antagonists such as Paul, the mine owner, are sketched with understanding and respect. Stand Up That Mountain is a compelling David versus Goliath story of a legal challenge to seemingly far more powerful business interests. It inspires hope that deserving underdogs can prevail in our justice system. So, accepting the honorable mention certificate is the author, J. Erskine Lutz.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. There are a lot of lawyers and a lot of people in my hometown of Dogtown, North Carolina, that are very excited that this book is getting national attention. This is a story about the power of the law. Ollie Cox called me on the telephone and told me she'd never wanted anything, and she couldn't get representation, and I told her that I failed the North Carolina bar exam and that I was the wrong person to help her, and she said, "Honey, you're the best we got." So we quickly engaged some private attorneys, and Southern Environmental Law Center came to take our case, and this case was really won by Ollie's niece, Ashley Cook, who read the Mining Act of 1971 on a dial-up internet connection that her Uncle Curly had given her for her birthday in the defunct auto repair shop that they lived in. So this is an honor for us and for our community and for the Appalachian Trail, and I'm pleased to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to say hello.
Thank you, Jay. The 2013 Gavel Award honorable mention for newspapers goes to Loss of Trust, San Jose Mercury News. Loss of trust is a special investigation into Santa Clara County Probate Court appointed trustees who charge extraordinary fees managing assets for their elderly and incapacitated clients. To dramatize these practices, the Mercury News focuses attention on one such client, 37-year-old Danny Reed. Father and son lawyers, Matt and Mike Crosby, take on Reed's case pro bono. Highlighting its investigation, the Mercury News also produced a 9-minute video that tells Danny Reed's story. Here's the introductory clip from the video, narrated by reporter Karen Dessa.
For more than a decade, Danny Reed has been trying to regain control of his life. First physically, now financially. He learned to walk and talk again after a car plowed into him, leaving him brain damaged and partially paralyzed. But nobody warned him about his next battle, fighting to keep the money that's been set aside for his lifelong care. Little did he know his fight would be with the person entrusted to watch out for him.
I've not been sleeping. I wake up in the dark hours of the morning. I'm just trying to fight this person off. I'm trying to keep this person from preying upon me.
All the money Danny Reed had in his trust, more than $500,000, came under the control of a court-appointed trustee. Now he fears there will be nothing left. Private professionals, known as fiduciaries, are appointed by judges to handle the care and finances of elderly and disabled people. In many cases, they play a vital role, orchestrating everything from complex money management to bedside care. But in Silicon Valley, their services can come at a steep cost. While Reed's case stands out among the roughly 1,500 elderly and incapacitated adults overseen by the Santa Clara County Superior Court, a Mercury News investigation revealed that a small group of the county's court-appointed fiduciaries are charging exorbitant fees, sometimes double the hourly rates that are allowed in most other Bay Area counties. And the Santa Clara County Court has few rules to deter them.
Well, the Danny Reed case represents the problem where you have an individual who is by definition powerless, vulnerable in a complex legal system where their rights and their money and their assets are being taken away from them.
Accepting the honorable mention certificate is Karen Dessa, staff reporter.
Thank you very much. I'm here today on behalf of an endangered species, which is investigative journalists at major metropolitan dailies. But we have a very hopeful story to tell tonight. In cases like this, we're making incredible difference, and we're not only desperately needed in society, but we're desperately appreciated, and our readers and the very people we cover have undying appreciation for what we do. This case, not only was Danny Reed made completely whole and then some after the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court in California, but within literally minutes of publication of our story, the court began revisiting its rules within weeks. They had completely overhauled and created new rules which curbed fees on the court-appointed fiduciaries. The state legislature in California has just passed a law which would also protect these vulnerable adults. And every single case we wrote about, in addition to Danny's, has had its fees revisited in court. And those included an elderly couple who fiduciary spent about 10 days organizing their mail and clipping their fingernails and charged $26,000. The elderly woman who hadn't signed a check in 10 years wrote a check for her services. And other cases like that were revisited, and the folks their bills were corrected. In this case, when our story got out first on the internet and then in the newspaper, which is what I'm most proud of, the presiding judge of the Superior Court called me from the hospital, and I had heard that his father was dying, and I said, listen, I can talk to the assistant presiding judge. Really, it's time for you to be with your father. You really don't need to be calling a reporter right now. And he said, Karen, I can't do anything about my father, but I can do something about this. And this is why we are still here and we're still strong. And although the last time I was up here a few years ago, I was part of a team of investigative reporters and I had an editor, and I'm now the last investigative reporter at my paper. It's events like these that remind my editors and our community why it's so important what we do. So I want to thank you for thanking us for this work. Thank you.
It's stories like these and people like Karen that we are really here honoring tonight, because we know the struggle that you are facing in every day. We would also like to recognize two other entries receiving honorable mention for the 2013 American Bar Association Gavel Awards for Media and the Arts. They are, in the documentary category, West of Memphis, Sony Pictures Classics, Wingnut Films, in association with Disarming Films. This documentary retries the case of the West Memphis Three, Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, and Jesse Miskelly, who in 1994 were convicted in Arkansas of murdering 3 8-year-old boys. It presents a fascinating and troubling case study of wrongful conviction. And that's all I'm going to say about it, and you need to see this. In the television category, we have The Real CSI, Frontline ProPublica, and the investigative reporting program at UC Berkeley. This program critically examines the state of forensic science in the criminal justice system. It commendably brings to public attention the problems and shortcomings of many forensic techniques, including, and I didn't know this, fingerprints and ballistic analysis, once seen as infallible. No longer. Again, I urge you to read more about these outstanding works in the program on your table and at the ABA website, ambar.org, under the Gavel Awards. And now for the presentation of the Silver Gavel Awards. The 2013 Silver Gavel Award for books goes to Lincoln's Code, The Laws of War in American History, Simon & Schuster, Free Press. John Fabian Witt's book is an enormously engaging narrative of the development of the rules governing the American way of making war. It ranges historically from colonial America to the early 20th century, with reflections on the post-9/11 period. The author's central focus, however, is the transformative effect of the so-called Lieber codes of the laws of war. Bet you didn't know there were laws of war. These were born out of the existential crisis of our own Civil War. The code grappled with the weightiest of issues: war crimes, the execution of prisoners, the treatment of guerrillas, and total war. Witt tells a brilliant story of the struggle of generations of American statesmen to reconcile war with law and law with war. It's a story often marked by brutality and self-interest, yet in the end, it's also the particularly American story of striving to establish and honor the rule of law, even in the most challenging of circumstances. In his interview with the ABA, which you'll see in a minute, Witt discusses how he came to write the book, who Francis Lieber was, and why we need to better understand the history of the laws of war.
My wife and I watched the second plane hit the World Trade Tower from our street in front of our apartment. And as the years went by after 9/11, all sorts of issues of international law and the laws of armed conflict suddenly seemed front and center, and I wanted to understand them. In the wars of the last decade, we've had a sense time and time again that we're in uncharted territory, that we're fighting new kinds of wars against new kinds of enemies who don't follow the rules, such that the rules that we have, the Geneva Conventions in particular, suddenly seem out of date, or even, as Alberto Gonzalez put it, quaint. I think if we read Lincoln's Code and we think about our history and we really grapple with it, we'll see that each generation of American soldiers and statesmen and lawyers and judges have encountered their own set of law of war crises in which the existing rules of that time have come to seem out of date, anachronistic, antiquated. And at our best moments, we've taken the tradition we have and we've tried to work with it. We've tried to work within it. We've tried to reshape it, to be sure, to make it fit the needs of the moment. But we've worked with that tradition. Francis Lieber is both one of the great forgotten characters of the American Civil War and also someone who I came to think captured the heart of the dilemma of the laws of war in American history. Lieber was a Prussian immigrant who came to the United States in the late 1820s, was a public intellectual for several decades, and then in the middle of the Civil War found himself with sons fighting on both sides. General Orders Number 100 is the code that Francis Lieber drafted for the Union Army in the winter of 1862-63. And that order, which went out under Lincoln's name, turned out to be the first code restatement of the international laws of war for the modern world. It went on to change the laws of war around the European world. It was translated immediately into German and other European languages and became the basis for the modern international laws of war that we have today. Lieber's views captured the terror of war and the necessity of war under certain dire kinds of circumstances. He managed to capture both humanitarian imperatives and also the imperatives of fighting when the situation so requires. Lincoln's Code is about the laws that govern armed conflict. It seems incredible that there could be laws that govern armed conflict at all, but it turns out that for hundreds of years, war hasn't just been brute force, though it's all too often horrific brute force. It's also been a conflict over ideas and symbols and meanings, and the laws of war have been humanity's desperate effort to articulate those symbols, norms, and meanings. And American history from the very beginning has been a central part of that. And to understand how we've gotten where we are, I think we need to understand a good deal about that history, a good deal more than we know.
Accepting the Silver Gavel Award is the author, John Fabian Witt.
Thank you for this really delightful honor. A book is a long time in the making, and somewhere around year 6, I started to think, I hope someone reads this. And so it's a real pleasure and a fulfilling moment to have the American Bar Association, a really glorious institution, confer this recognition on the book. The laws of war are a topic that many people think is a paradox. It's like an oxymoron. War is when law stops. I'd like to think that Lincoln's Code might begin a conversation that could help explain why it is that today we read so much about lawyers in war. And that turns out to be a long story, not just a recent departure. And so I'm really honored and delighted, and thank you very much.
And I can assure you, John, there were a number of people who read the book. So, the 2013 Silver Gavel Award for documentaries goes to the Central Park Five, Florentine Films. The Central Park Five recounts the story of 5 Black and Latino teenagers from Harlem falsely convicted of raping a young white woman in 1989. The filmmakers situate their story in the 1980s New York. They masterfully integrate archival footage and interviews with insightful social observers to recreate the mood of a city fissured by race and class, its residents fearful of ubiquitous crime and violence. The teenage boys who became the Central Park Five are interrogated. Even though they are innocent, 4 confess. All 5 are convicted. How could such a miscarriage of justice have happened? We'll listen to a clip in which 3 of the 5 read their own false confessions aloud in disbelief now at their own words then. Following that, filmmaker Sarah Burns explains her interest in the case, why it is important that the Central Park Five are able to tell their own story, and what she would like the impact of the film to be.
As the time just, went on, my father wasn't doing nothing. So I was just like, whatever, yeah, I had something to do with it. Just to get out of there.
Then we saw this lady jogger. She had on gray shorts with black biking pants and a white tank top.
I observed the male, Black Kevin, with scratch on face, was struggling with a female.
The tall, thin black guy hit her in the ribs with a pipe.
I moved back and everybody started feeling on her.
Antron came and started ripping her clothes off.
The Puerto Rican kid with the black hoodie jumped on her.
I tried to grab her. I got scratched on my face.
Antron pulled her pants off and she was screaming.
Antron had sex with her.
Then Kevin got on.
That's when she was yelling, "Stop and help." I was the one that didn't rape her.
Kevin pulled down his pants and had sex with her. When she was on the floor, I grabbed her tits. A 14-year-old boy doesn't talk like this, you know?
At that time, being naive, I figured, I'm not mutilating myself.
I was crying at that time. He said, "Don't worry, you did good. Everything's gonna be okay."
When I first went there, they said I was gonna be a witness. And then everything just flipped, you know? They had me raping a woman, beating her. And they read the statement to my mother. And she looked at me, I was like, "Ma, I didn't do it." She's like, "Okay, I don't know you didn't do it."
I walked in the room and I could see that he was terrified. I could see him like shivering. I said, "Kevin, I can't believe you saw this woman get raped." And he looked at me. He said, "Angie, I didn't see her." And I said, "Kevin, why did you say that then?" He said, "Because he told me to say it so I could go home." But it was like an orchestra, like they orchestrated this whole thing, and I felt so dumb for not realizing it until it was too late.
I first learned about the story of the Central Park Five as a college student, an undergraduate. I was working for a pair of civil rights lawyers and learned about this case, and it just captured my attention. It fit with what I was interested in studying, and I ended up writing my undergraduate thesis about the case and then went on to write a book about it. So at that point, making a film was obvious. The three of us got together and knew that we had to make this film, that this story needed to be told, needed to get to a wider audience, and that by making a film, we could hear from the five themselves and give them an opportunity to tell their own story. I think that, especially when it comes to false confessions, it's very difficult for the average person to understand or be able to relate to how a false confession happens, why someone would give a false confession. It's irrational, it's illogical, and it's easy to sit there and say, well, I would never do that, and so therefore, why would they have done that? And so for us, it was very important to tell the story in a way that people could relate to and understand what the situation was that could lead to a false confession. What we are trying to achieve here with this film is to help people understand how this happens, how it happened in this case and in general, and also to get to know the Central Park Five as individuals, to hear their story from them in the hopes that that can help to restore their humanity a little bit in opposition to the way that they were treated by the media at the time. They were so dehumanized, but also to see the human toll that a wrongful conviction takes on these five men, on their families, on a community, really on the whole system when we get it wrong. And I think that's a really important part of the story, and one that is much larger than just these five men. Racism is a hugely important factor in this story. We see it in the media coverage, in the language that's used to describe these kids, teenagers. They're called animals, savages. The terms that are associated with this story are wilding and wolf pack more than anything else. And I think that it's very clear that it's not language that would be used to describe a group of white teenagers who were accused of harassing and assaulting people or raping someone even, as these kids were accused. And that's very telling. The way that people responded to this narrative of what had happened in the park that night has everything to do with race. We really hope that this film can be the beginning of a conversation about how wrongful convictions happen. And we've found that to be the case as we've gone around and shared this film with audiences all over the country and in some other countries as well, that people want to talk about this. They want to know more. They want to know what's happening now, and they want to talk about why this happens, what the factors are, what goes wrong. And that's the kind of conversation that we want to happen as a result of people seeing this film, and I think that it is happening.
Accepting the Silver Gavel are Sarah Burns and David McMahon, directors, writers, producers, and Stephanie Jenkins, production coordinator.
Thank you, Corey and Laurel, and thank you to the ABA. And I'd like to commend the ABA for exceptionally good use of the Ken Burns effect on those photos and the video presentations for John's and ours. So that was very well done. As Sarah said in the presentation, our hope was to help restore the humanity of these men and also to understand the legal aspects of it. Why is it that wrongful convictions happen, and especially false confessions? They happen much more often than we could ever imagine, as you all know. And so we were anxious to figure out why that is, and so we're grateful that the ABA has recognized our work. I just have to acknowledge our supporters. WETA has been our presenting station for a long time, and they were with us from the beginning. Atlantic Philanthropies, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and Bobby and Polly Stein were great financial supporters of the film. And I have to recognize also our other colleagues who aren't here to join us, Ken Burns, Michael Levine, our master editor, who took a sprawling 5-hour rough cut that would have put you all to sleep and transformed it into a 2-hour movie that could be absorbed in a single sitting, which for a Ken Burns documentary is no small feat. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Also, in addition to thanking the ABA for this wonderful honor, we have to thank the Central Park Five, who didn't have to share their story with us, and they did, and they really opened themselves up and shared something, I think, really extraordinary, and we're very grateful for having had the opportunity to tell their story and to try to share it with a broader audience and to start that conversation about how this happens. So thanks especially to them. Thank you.
Thank you. The 2013 Silver Gavel Award for newspapers goes to Free to Kill, Detroit Free Press. The Michigan Department of Corrections began releasing more convicts back into the community through parole or probation. This policy reform was a response to increasing budget constraints and the high cost of incarceration. However, the investigation by the Detroit Free Press revealed that the department failed in its implementation of this change of policy, with consequences that were at times deadly. Lax controls leave ex-cons free to kill, as the newspaper succinctly put it. The state's 70,000 parolees and probationers were inadequately monitored. Many were not outfitted with electronic tethers as required. Even after repeated parole violations, many were not returned to prison. Free to Kill sheds light on a government failing at its first duty, to keep its citizens safe. It exemplifies the essential role the press can play as a watchdog over our legal and law enforcement systems. Series co-author Lori Brashear talks about why the newspaper decided to investigate the practices of the Michigan Department of Corrections, what they found, and the impact of their series.
Free to Kill was a 7-month investigation by the Detroit Free Press, taking a look at why there was an increase in very violent crimes committed by parolees and probationers who were supposed to be supervised. We found in reporting on Free to Kill is that we had what appeared to be a systemic failure with the Michigan Department of Corrections. The Michigan Department of Corrections is in charge of the prison system here in Michigan. It's a $2 billion operation, and it is also in charge of supervising parolees and probationers who are released into the community. So they're in charge of keeping the community safe. We decided to look into the Michigan Department of Corrections after an elderly woman was killed in one of our communities, Royal Oak. She was murdered by 2 parolees. When we learned that these 2 parolees had actually been in custody and were questioned and released even though the supervisors knew that they were suspects in these new crimes, we began to look at some of the other more violent crimes that had been committed in Metro Detroit. And we started to see this pattern of very violent crime committed by parolees and probationers, and that prompted us to take the deep dive into MDOC and their record and what was happening. We were in a almost constant struggle with the Michigan Department of Corrections over access to records. At one point, when we first began filing Freedom of Information Act requests, the department wanted to charge the Free Press more than $260,000 in copying fees. So we were going back and forth with that. We had our attorney involved. There were long delays in getting the documents that we required. We went into the community. We talked to victims. We actually went into halfway houses and interviewed parolees. We had a lot of confidential sources that we were dealing with who were providing us with information about what was actually going on within the administration of the Michigan Department of Corrections. So there was this commitment on the part of the Free Press to tell this story and try to tell it well. We like to think it had a pretty big impact. The Department of Corrections, when we began writing about it, started to take corrective action. They opened up new prison space. They tightened up regulation in terms of how parolees and probationers are supervised. They made it easier to send people who were violating their paroles and probation back to prison or jail. I think that when you go up against a large institution like a Department of Corrections, it's intimidating, and it's easy to write daily stories about crimes that occur. But sometimes I think as journalists we have to step back and look and see if we see a pattern, and if we do, and in this case we did, to actually go after the whole package, to take a look at the entire bureaucracy, the entire culture of the department, what's going on, what needs to be changed, and bring that to our readers.
Accepting the Silver Gavel are Lori Brashear and Dina Damron, co-authors and staff writers.
Thank you. We are thrilled with this award. The Free Press is thrilled with the award. Our mothers are thrilled with this award. We are exceptionally lucky to work for the Detroit Free Press because it's a newspaper that remains committed to investigative journalism. I was thinking about the San Jose Reporter. You don't see as much of it as we should see. We're a struggling newspaper in a struggling city. Detroit's been in the news in the last week or so. Despite these struggles, the Free Press continues to dedicate a lot of resources to do these kinds of stories. We have an investigative team at the Free Press, but neither Gina or I are on it. We're just beat reporters. And when we started to see this trend on our beats, we went to our editors and said, we think there's a bigger story here. And our editor said, go for it. They gave us 7 months, thousands of dollars for copying fees, not $250,000, but we had access to attorneys who would fight FOIA issues with us, and we were able to produce this 3-part series, because the newspaper stood by us. And that's why these awards are really important, because it tells people that this is the kind of work that newspapers can do, and that newspapers can do it well. So thank you very much. And my mother thanks you.
I think Lori covered like all of my talking points in that interview, so let me go through this. I think when we started working on this project, we learned pretty quickly, once we got all these documents after months and months of fighting with, the Department of Corrections. Let me lower this so I don't have to stand on my tiptoes. That, we had a really big story here, and that this was a major problem with the state. This lack of supervision had, as Lori said, really disastrous consequences for people. I personally think that the biggest impact, is shown in our victims' families. I mean, they told us time and time again how painful these crimes were for them. They really questioned how this actually could have happened and what could have been done to prevent it, which is kind of what we tried to address in this story. We're really proud of this project. Like Lori said, there were some pretty sweeping changes made even before this project was printed. Actually, they started suspending and firing probation and parole agents who weren't doing the job that they were supposed to be doing even before the series came out. So anyway, we hope that this has a lasting impact, and we feel really fortunate to have been able to do this. So thank you.
Well, thank you. We really appreciate the work that you're doing. As I mentioned, this is not easy, and there's not a lot of resources for it. Last but not least, the 2013 Silver Gavel Award for Television goes to Electoral Dysfunction. Trio Pictures, in association with WTTW National Productions and the Center for Independent Documentary. Electoral Dysfunction is a very, very entertaining and enlightening program featuring political humorist Mo Rocca's road trip to see how voting works and doesn't work in America. The program educates viewers about the vital role voting and elections play in our representative democracy, cleverly presenting that serious message with immense creativity, good humor, and energy. Rocca finds many citizens admirably committed to making electoral democracy work. Still, the program is titled Electoral Dysfunction for a reason, as it takes on the idiosyncrasies and inconsistencies of a voting system that, while national in scope, is regulated by the states through some 13,000 election jurisdictions. All in all, Electoral Dysfunction is a lively exercise in civic education. Viewers will come away with a deeper appreciation for why voting in the United States is both a right and a privilege. The trailer you're about to see introduces us to the program, and in his interview, Mo Rocca then talks about how he became involved, why Indiana was chosen for filming, and what viewers can learn from electoral dysfunction.
Do you know where I can find the Electoral College?
No, I'm from Tennessee.
George W. Bush is the winner of Florida's 25 electoral votes.
We have 13,000 election jurisdictions that run elections 13,000 different ways.
We have the strictest voter ID law in the country.
There is no right to vote in the Constitution.
That's not fair at all.
Electoral dysfunction. Where's the pill for this affliction?
I'm Mo Rocca.
Rocca the vote!
My journey began 4 years ago.
Let's go.
I wanted to see for myself how voting works in America. In a swing state, of course, since those are the ones that actually decide our elections.
Back home again.
That's right, Indiana.
In Indiana.
Where the passion for politics runs deep. Are you concerned about voter fraud?
Yes.
What kind?
Democrats.
My job is to turn out every Democrat voter.
As a member of the Republican National Committee, I'm going to do whatever I can.
What the Republicans are wanting to do is to challenge all the absentee ballots.
There's just some fishy things going on even in the area.
They don't want these votes counted. That's the bottom line.
We've heard of Mickey Mouse being registered and Dumbo.
This isn't Florida. This ain't the Sunshine State. Every vote's gonna count here.
There are cracks in our democracy. The way that elections are run is dysfunctional.
Electoral dysfunction began with the producers David Deschamps, Bennett Singer, and Leslie Farrell, who, after the 2000 election, started thinking a lot about what was wrong with voting in America and why it was so apparently prone to complication and confusion. And they, as all documentary filmmakers apparently do, worked many years before they were even ready to begin filming. So I came in relatively late in the process. I had the easy part. They came to me and said, would you like to be our host? Would you like to be the person who is going on a journey and genuinely learning about how elections in America work, how voting works? I was drawn to the subject, strange as though it may sound, in part because I found it so challenging to make interesting.
What's that?
You're still cheating! Everybody should think it's unfair because it's not just about the elector's vote, it's about everybody's vote.
Aubrey, you are a rabble-rouser.
It was one of those topics that's undeniably important, vitally important to a democracy, and a topic that makes most people's eyes glaze over. And that, to me, is an exciting creative challenge. How do you take something that undeniably matters, but also bores people nearly to death, and make it interesting? So that intrigued me. And it was something that I knew embarrassingly little about. And I thought, well, here's an opportunity for me to tackle a topic that really matters and learn about it at the same time. Most precious resources in making any documentary, I've learned, are belief in the subject matter and lack of cynicism, because keeping the train moving, believing in what you're doing when you're not an action movie backed up by $80 million from a studio, it really tests your faith. Indiana was selected because it was a swing state for the first time in over 30 years in 2008. And it had a landmark voter ID law that was upheld by the Supreme Court, a law that has been replicated in many states now, a law that became the model for many state laws across the country, voter ID laws. My experience there actually deepened my faith in our democracy because I saw people of both parties, lowly paid or unpaid, jumping through all sorts of hoops, through rules and regulations that you would think were the creation of Jonathan Swift in a satire, and doing all this to pull off an election for the rest of us. And that they should have to go through all these twists and turns is absurd. That they do is very heartening. I think that people in general should pay more attention to elections, understand how they work, and rally to make the changes that should be made to simplify it and to make it a more logical process, and thus a more fair process, and thus a process that more people believe in and participate in. If you care about electoral democracy, if you care about voting, the electoral dysfunction is a painless and actually entertaining way to spend 90 minutes and learn about voting, how one of the most sacred acts in American life actually works.
Accepting the Silver Gavel are Bennett Singer and David Deschamps, producers, writers, and directors.
Well, on behalf of the entire team, I would like to thank you all for this honor. And Mo joins us in spirit. He was supposed to be here, but now that he's a full-time correspondent for CBS News, his other life intervened. So sadly, he wasn't able to be here in person, but I talked to him earlier today, and he does send his gratitude along with ours. I think it was back in 2006 when David came to me and said, we have to do a film about voting. I mean, how can it be that the person who gets the most votes doesn't win the election in the world's greatest democracy? Or even more fundamentally, when we started talking to constitutional scholars how can it be that the Constitution doesn't affirmatively guarantee the right to vote? And so we did set out to create a film that, if dare I say, it was entertaining, but also elucidating and illuminating. And Mo turned out to be, I think, the perfect host. And so, like the other winners, I do have a bunch of thank yous that I would like to acknowledge in helping bring this project to reality. Our funders, certainly Ford Foundation, MacArthur Foundation at the top of the list, the team at PBS and WTTW in particular, our outreach partners who really helped us take this film to local communities and campuses around the country and are continuing to do so in particular, and some of them are represented here tonight. The Brennan Center, Rock the Vote, Fair Vote, the League of Women Voters, Fair Elections Legal Network, the American Constitution Society, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the New Press, which published the companion book to Electoral Dysfunction, and its author, Victoria Bassetti. And then finally, we'd like to acknowledge the dozens of teachers who have used the film with several thousand students since it came out last fall. It's thanks to their enthusiastic reactions that we are now in the process of creating a classroom edition of the documentary, working closely with the Campaign for the Civic Mission of Schools. Our goal is to be able to give away copies of this resource to every middle school and high school civics and social studies teacher who requests it. And evidently there are tens of thousands of those classrooms, and our goal is to have this in their hands before the next election. One sobering note tying into tonight's evening, of the two primary storytellers in the film, you saw Mike Marshall, our Democratic Get Out the Vote activist, as well as Dee Dee Banky. At the end of the film, there was a surprising twist when Mike was indicted on 45 counts of voter fraud. According to his supporters, this was a witch hunt, really engineered because he had been so effective in using absentee ballots to turn out voters in unprecedented numbers. The grand jury process left him facing life in prison, and the trial, actually after incurring over $100,000 in legal costs, Mike decided to enter into a plea. So it was just last month that he was found guilty on 3 of these charges and sentenced to 18 months in prison. So he is in prison at the moment. And so I think that while our tone and our spirit in this film was indeed lighthearted, there is a very serious message here, and that is that voting matters, that the process of voting is incredibly important, and that people are putting their lives on the line for that right. So I'd like to say thank you again to the ABA. I think I speak for all the winners in saying that your commitment to using film and media to heighten awareness and to spark change is incredibly inspiring and means so much to David and me and to our entire team. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, because without all of your efforts, the messages that you're bringing to the public about the law, about lawyers, about our legal process would not be told, would certainly not be told with such creativity, would not be told with such passion, and would not be told with such entertainment, that's for sure. So now, if you would please join me in a round of applause for the 2013 Silver Gavel Award.
Not standing on my toes through this whole event. Who was that? That was very, I was very impressed. All right. Corey, of course, thank you for your leadership of this Civil Gavel Award Committee. And there are a number of the Gavel Award Committee who did a lot of reading, a lot of viewing, a lot of newspapers, a lot of documentaries. I know they're here. If they would stand up for a second, I would like to recognize the members of the committee who were responsible for these awards. And my personal congratulations for using the spark, as you say, of journalism to instill in our community and our country the meaning of our law and the importance of justice. It is now my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Linda Greenhouse. Since 2009, Ms. Greenhouse has been the Knight Distinguished Journalist in Residence and Joseph Goldstein Lecturer in Law at Yale Law School. These appointments at Yale 4 years ago followed a distinguished 40-year career at the New York Times. As I suspect most of you are well aware, Ms. Greenhouse devoted the last 30 of those years to reporting on the U.S. Supreme Court and its cases. At Yale, she is currently a member of the faculty of the Supreme Court Advocacy Clinic and teaches other Supreme Court-related courses. I'm pleased to note that Ms. Greenhouse served the ABA from 2009 to 2012 as a member of the Advisory Commission to our Standing Committee on Public Education. Ms. Greenhouse has written several books, including Becoming Justice Blackmun, a biography of the justice, Before Roe v. Wade, Voices That Shaped the Abortion Debate Before the Supreme Court's Ruling, co-authored with Yale professor Reva Siegel, and most recently, the U.S. Supreme Court, A Very Short Introduction. She earned a BA from Radcliffe College, Harvard, and is a member of the Harvard University Board of Overseers. In 1978, Ms. Greenhouse received a Master's of Studies in Law degree from Yale Law, which she attended on a Ford Foundation Fellowship. Ms. Greenhouse is just one of 2 non-lawyer honorary members of the American Law Institute, which awarded her its Henry J. Friendly Medal. In addition, Ms. Greenhouse has received numerous journalism awards for her reporting, including the Goldsmith Career Award for Excellence in Journalism from Harvard University's Kennedy School in 2004, the Carrie McWilliams Award from the American Political Science Association in 2002, for a major journalistic contribution to our understanding of politics, and a Pulitzer Prize in 1998 for her consistently illuminating coverage of the United States Supreme Court. I'm delighted to welcome Linda Greenhouse.
Thank you, Laurel. My role here is really superfluous because this has been a great program. I'm in awe of the winners. And a lot of these entries have great personal resonance. The last one, coming 2 weeks after the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act, is a little sobering. And you know, the Central Park 5 case, the clinic that Laurel mentioned that I teach in at Yale Law School, the Supreme Court Clinic, we represented one of the members of the so-called Norfolk Four, who were 4 young soldiers who falsely confessed to a grisly murder. And, you know, I was one of the people who said, how could somebody falsely confess to a murder that they didn't commit? But our client, you know, explained this, and we put on a program at Yale, had a psychologist from the Yale University Psychology Department come in and explain how this happens. And it was just the most compelling thing. I won't get into his case because it didn't really have to do with that at this point. But anyway, thinking of investigative reporting, and you folks being sort of the last investigative reporters standing, thank heavens I was never called upon to be an investigative reporter. I would have been a terrible one. I never had a confidential source. I spent my 30 years covering the court, you know, basically sitting in my little cubicle and reading briefs and reading opinions. I did have one moment of potential glory back in the Watergate days when I was a very young reporter on Weekend Rewrite, in New York, very elegant assignment. And of course, the Times was very desperate because the Washington Post was running circles around the Times with the Watergate story. And a phone call came into the desk from a guy who said, I'm at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and I really have the goods on Watergate. I know everything, and I'd like to talk to a Times reporter. And I was like the only person in the newsroom. So out of desperation, they asked me to go over to the Waldorf Astoria, which, of course, I Dad, now's my chance. You know, who is this Woodward and Bernstein? And I had the room number, and I knocked on the door, and the guy opened the door stark naked. I ran out of there so fast. I knew I had reached my limit. So I'm going to talk briefly. I mean, the ABA was nice enough to invite me, so I figured I should share with you a couple of substantive thoughts, and I'll just say, as Laurel mentioned, I've had a long involvement with the ABA, first as a reporter and most recently on the Advisory Commission. I've known some of the folks involved with the Silver Gavel Award for some years, and I think it is one of the most important public acts that the ABA does in recognizing this kind of work. I think it's a fabulous thing. So for my substantive remarks, I thought I'd say a few things about the First Amendment, because something very strange has been happening recently with the First Amendment since the time that many of us learned to just sort of reflexively salute anything that came wrapped in a First Amendment package. There's actually a new dynamic. I just thought many of you know this, I'm sure this is old news, but for those of you who don't, propelled by the current Supreme Court that's in the process of kind of turning the First Amendment upside down. It turns out that the First Amendment doesn't do what many of us thought it did, and see the predicament that my former New York Times colleague Jim Risen is currently in. And it does do things that I'm willing to bet many of us never associated with the First Amendment. It protects very robustly, ever more so, the advertising of goods and services, more than it seems to protect conventional First Amendment targets of protection like the press. First Amendment's become a powerful deregulatory tool invoked to strike down, for instance, a congressional requirement for graphic advertising on cigarette packaging. This is an anti-smoking initiative that many other countries are engaged in, and it's found to be very effective in such repressive countries as Canada and Australia. That requirement infringed the cigarette company's First Amendment rights, the DC Circuit ruled. And the First Amendment has been invoked to invalidate a longstanding provision of federal food and drug law that prohibits pharmaceutical companies from advertising to doctors the off-label uses of their FDA-approved medications. That was also an appellate court decision. And the Obama administration was so uncertain of winning at the Supreme Court that it decided not to appeal either case. And that was not a foolish judgment on the administration's part. It was just a few years ago in a case called Sorrell against IMS Health that a Supreme Court majority struck down a Vermont law that was intended to protect the privacy of healthcare consumers by prohibiting data mining companies from obtaining pharmacies' prescription records. The data mining companies get these records and then sell them to the pharmaceutical industry, which then uses them to target doctors who might be persuaded to switch their patients from a low-cost generic to a high-priced big pharma alternative treatment for the same condition. The Vermont law violated the company's free speech rights, the Supreme Court ruled. In the tobacco case, the cigarette manufacturers raised a First Amendment claim not to be compelled to carry the government's message in their packaging. They were successful, much more so than doctors who've raised a First Amendment claim against being compelled to carry a state's anti-abortion message in advising patients seeking to terminate a pregnancy. A South Dakota law requires doctors to warn women that they will be at, quote, increased risks of suicide ideation and suicide, unquote, if they go ahead with an abortion. This is false. In fact, multiple peer-reviewed studies have demonstrated that the opposite is true, and that, in fact, terminating an unwanted pregnancy either has no long-term effect on a woman's mental health or actually brings about, quote, positive psychological change. And that's understandable, since a crisis pregnancy that a woman wants to terminate, obviously, she'll feel better if she terminates it. But the United States Supreme Court, the United States Court of Appeals for the Eighth Circuit upheld that requirement. And the pro-choice groups, in an abundance of caution, but I think probably not foolishly, decided against bringing that case to the Supreme Court. And how's the traditional First Amendment faring these days? If big tobacco and big pharma are entitled to First Amendment protection, how about individuals who practice what we might call journalism, but do it in non-traditional media, in blog posts, on the web, on nobody's payroll? And that applies, of course, to many people these days, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, maybe more than that. The rise of non-traditional media, which many of us rely on in this room and certainly in our children's generation, has brought to the fore old First Amendment questions that the Supreme Court has never got around to answering back in the days in the 1960s and 1970s when the court was inventing the constitutional landscape of libel and defamation that we rely on today. And it's becoming urgent for the court to answer these questions. I'm not presumptuous enough to know exactly what the answer should be in every case, but I think I know a wrong answer when I see one. So see what you think about a case from Oregon that's now pending before the Ninth Circuit. It's a defamation case called Obsidian Finance Group against Crystal Cox. Crystal Cox is a self-described investigative blogger who alleged corruption on the part of a court-appointed bankruptcy trustee. The bankruptcy trustee sued. She, Crystal Cox, claimed First Amendment protection under either one of two leading Supreme Court precedents, New York Times against Sullivan. Public officials, later expanded, of course, to public figures, have to show actual malice, as we all know, that the defendant knew the report was false or acted in reckless disregard of truth or falsity. 10 years later, the court in Gertz against Robert Welch, the court held that private figure libel suits, courts can't impose liability without fault and can't award punitive damages without a finding of actual malice. But those old decisions, and subsequent ones as well, have left open the question of whether the constitutional protections apply to non-media defendants, or to put it another way, who is the press today? That question is presented with some urgency in this Obsidian Finance case, because under Oregon law, which is the law that the federal district court had to apply, the fault standards apply to media defendants only. In rejecting the defendant's claim to be part of the media, here's what Federal District Judge Marco Hernandez had to say. And I'll just read the key paragraph from the opinion that's on appeal. Quote, "Defendant fails to bring forth any evidence suggestive of her status as a journalist. For example, there's no evidence of, 1, any education in journalism, 2, any credentials or proof of any affiliation with any recognized news entity, 3, proof of adherence to journalistic standards such as editing, fact-checking, or disclosures of conflicts of interest. 4, keeping notes of conversations and interviews conducted. 5, mutual understanding or agreement of confidentiality between a defendant and his or her source, as if that's any kind of protection. 6, creation of an independent product rather than assembling, writing, or postings of others. And 7, contacting, quote, the other side, unquote, to get both sides of a story. Without evidence of this nature, defendant is not media, unquote." Wow, so we have a federal judge telling us that we need a journalism degree. I mean, I never took a journalism course, so I don't know where that would leave me. That keeping notes, having mutual understanding of confidentiality, you know, Jim Risen can tell that to the Fourth Circuit. This is an extremely rigid definition, obviously, that the Ninth Circuit on appeal is being asked to reject. It's a definition that would eliminate some very notable silver gavel winners, in fact. What's the right definition of who deserves First Amendment protection? The Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, in its amicus brief to the Ninth Circuit, proposes, quote, "an individual engaged in the practice of compiling information for public dissemination," unquote. Does that go too far in the other direction? Or more precisely, will the Supreme Court thinks it goes too far in the other direction? I can only invite you to watch that space. I urge you to watch that space. Take nothing for granted when it comes to the First Amendment, but then nobody ever won a Silver Gavel Award for bowing to conventional wisdom or taking anything for granted. I'm really honored to have been invited to join this company and speak to you, so thank you very much.
Well, thank you for those remarks, Linda, and ending it the way you did. I take nothing for granted when it comes to our democracy and our ability to speak out about it. So thank you so much. I am now at the point to call upon you to wait 1 minute before giving a round of applause to everybody, because awardees, along with your awards, would you join me up here? And then everybody will be able to give you a round of applause. And then we'll take some pictures, and then we'll adjourn. Right, so awardees, up here with us, please. And your awards. Bring your gavels with you. So ladies and gentlemen, will you join Corey and I in thanking everybody here and congratulating them for the 2013 Civil Gavel Award winners, right? That's what I love, enthusiastic applause. Thank you for being with us this evening. We're adjourned.
Until next year.
Until next year, right.